Great. Thanks so much, Becky. First of all, I guess I'll just mention that you should all have a PDF of the presentation, the slides in front of you. So I'll just say next slide as I advance from slide to slide. And today I'm going to be talking to you about really the scientific literature and what it tells us about the role that organic agriculture can play as part of a climate change solution. Next slide. So I'm going to be covering three main topics. First, why should we consider agriculture when we're talking about climate change? So a lot of times we think about climate change and images of manufacturing and transportation are what come to our mind. But why is it important for us to consider the way in which agricultural products are produced? Then I'm going to give you some background on the literature that examines the role of organic production in climate change mitigation, including data from some key studies. And I'm going to end by talking to you about some really exciting new research that was just published. And this was work that was done by Northeastern University in collaboration with the Organic Center staff. Next slide. So 40% of the Earth's ice-free surface is used for agricultural production. And in the United States alone, 330 million acres of land are devoted to agriculture. Next slide. And so this map really allows us to visualize the extent of that coverage. So basically, any land area that you see covered in brown represents land that is devoted in some way to range or cropland. And you can see that the vast majority of our land is devoted to agriculture in some way. So almost all of our land is brown with the exception of land surfaces that are covered in ice to the far north, and then some major biomes like the Amazon rainforest and the Sahara Desert. So with a global population that's projected to exceed 9 billion people by 2050, the extent of our success in really mitigating climate change is in part going to be directly tied to sustainably managing agricultural land that's already under production. Next slide. So agriculture is a major contributor to total greenhouse gas emissions. Studies have demonstrated that food systems contribute 19 to 29% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions, and agricultural production contributes to around 80% of those total food systems emissions. So these greenhouse gas emissions contribute directly to global climate change, and the projected increases in extreme weather events such as extended droughts, flooding, high-intensity storms, these all have a real potential to threaten our food security. Next slide. So when it comes to agriculture and climate change, there are really two ways to be part of the problem or two ways to be part of the solution. So the first is by increasing or decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, and the second is by releasing or sequestering carbon in our soil. Next slide. So agricultural greenhouse gas emissions are typically classified as either direct emissions or indirect emissions. Direct emissions are greenhouse gases that are produced and released on the farm, and some of the biggest on-farm emitters of direct greenhouse gas emissions include fossil fuel combustion for things like running tractors or irrigation pumps, methane release from livestock and livestock waste, and nitrous oxide release from the breakdown of animal waste or excessive fertilizer application. Next slide. Now, indirect emissions are emissions that are directly related to agricultural production, but they're typically released off of the farm. And one of the major indirect sources of greenhouse gas emissions is the result of fossil fuel use for the manufacture and transport of on-farm inputs, and in particular, synthetic ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Now, this is because that industrial chemical process used to create fertilizer requires a source of hydrogen atoms, and that source is typically natural gas or methane. So it's not just that it uses a lot of energy to operate a fertilizer manufacturing plant. It does, but the actual chemical reaction used to make that fertilizer requires a fossil fuel input. Next slide. So now we're going to flip that coin, and we're going to talk a little bit about carbon. So currently 80% of Earth's terrestrial carbon is stored in our soils. And with the exception of the ocean, soils are the Earth's largest carbon sink. Now, with proper management of our agricultural soils, we can increase carbon sequestration and hence contribute to climate change mitigation, while conversely, improper management actually depletes those carbon stores, releases that carbon into the atmosphere, and contributes to climate change.
And Tracy, Tracy, just to interrupt for a second, sorry. I do hear a couple of noises in the background. If I could have everybody put your phone on mute, so it's *6 just to pop onto mute. Sorry to interrupt, Tracy. Carry on.
Oh, yeah, no problem at all. So a study just came out a couple months ago that shows that this is exactly what has been happening. We've been depleting our carbon stores. This research was published in the journal, The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And what they found was that over the last 1,200 years, 133 billion metric tons of carbon have been lost from the top 2 meters of soil globally. They also found that the rate of carbon loss has increased dramatically over the last 200 years. And this accelerated rate of loss has likely been due to increased conversion of native ecosystems to agricultural land as our populations grow and expand, as well as increased intensification of farming systems. So if you take a look at this map, you'll see that it looks really similar to the last one that I showed you, except for it's much more colorful. And basically any area that's yellow, orange, or red indicates areas where carbon has been lost from the soil. And red indicates the area where there's been the most carbon loss. Now, if we take a look specifically at the United States, you can see there's a big red patch right in the middle of the Midwest. And of course, this is land that used to be native prairie, which is an ecosystem that stores immense amounts of carbon below the ground. But now it's been converted almost exclusively to intensive corn and soybean production. Next slide. So today's large-scale industrial farms are depleting our soils, and they're contributing to climate change in a variety of ways. Now, some of the most harmful practices include the overuse of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides while failing to recycle organic matter back into the soil. Next slide. Now, conversely, a growing body of research really points to organic farming techniques as means to build soil carbon while simultaneously reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving energy efficiency. So some of these techniques include fallowing, which allows organic matter to accumulate and decompose. That's restoring nutrients into the soil. Next slide. The use of crop rotations. Next slide. Manure and legume fertilizer. And this is really important not only because these management techniques are used in place of synthetic fertilizers, but they also recycle organic matter back into the soil. Next slide. And then, of course, the prohibition of most synthetic pesticides, which, again, similar to synthetic fertilizers, are also energy intensive to create. Next slide. So now I'm going to transition, and I'm going to start showing you some data that support these assertions. So these results that you're looking at now are from a study conducted by researchers at the University of Illinois. And what they did was to compare soil health among 9 long-term farming trial systems that were set up across the United States. So they compared 3 types of plots from these different trials: organic plots that used a combination of manure and legumes to increase soil fertility, organic plots that use legumes only to increase soil fertility, and then conventional plots. And tillage was utilized in all of these plots. So if we take a look at this graph, on our y-axis, which is the vertical axis, that's the amount of soil organic carbon in the soil. And then you can see the amount of soil organic carbon for our organic plots that use manures and legumes. The amount of soil organic carbon for our plots that use only legumes is the second bar. And then finally, the amount that was seen in our conventional plots. And they found that when they just compared the organic plots, so the 2 organic plots, the use of manure or legume cover crop for fertility didn't lead to any significant change in the amount of soil organic carbon that was measured. However, there was a 14% increase in soil organic carbon in organic plots as compared to the conventional plots. Now, maybe you're thinking that this research is comparing systems that utilize tillage, and we know that, it's really mostly just organic farmers that are utilizing tillage these days, and that most conventional farmers are using no and low till techniques. So I want to just take this moment to point out that according to the most recent data published by the USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service, the same proportion of organic and conventional farmers utilize low and no-till farming techniques, and that's about 40%. So the common assumption that all organic farmers till and all conventional farmers do not till is in fact not true at all. Next slide. But just to play to the critics, I want to show you some research that compares soil organic carbon in organic systems that utilize tillage versus conventional systems that are no-till systems. So this data is from the USDA's Agricultural Research Services Farming Systems Project. This is an experiment that was established in 1996. and it provides long-term comparisons of organic and conventional cropping systems. Now, typically, studies that compare soil organic carbon sample at very shallow depths. However, this study quantified soil organic carbon at intervals all the way down to a depth of 1 meter. So if you go ahead and you look at the graph on the left-hand side, our y-axis, that vertical axis, represents soil depth. So 0 up at the top, that's ground level, going down to a depth of 80 centimeters. And then the x-axis, that horizontal axis at the top, that's the amount of total soil organic carbon. So if we look at the dotted line here, this represents the measurements of soil organic carbon that were taken at these different depths for our conventional no-till plots. The solid line represents the measurements that were taken from the organic tillage plots. And you can see that for about the first 8 centimeters of depth, the conventional no-till plots do have higher levels of soil organic carbon. But once we drop from about 8 centimeters down to 40 centimeters, the organic tillage plots actually have higher levels of soil organic carbon. And then from about 40 centimeters down to a meter, there's no statistical difference in the amount of soil organic carbon. Now, if we take a look at the graph right next to that on the right-hand side, this is basically the sum of all those measurements. So again, on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have the amount of soil organic carbon that was measured. And we can see that there's higher levels of total soil organic carbon in that organic plot that utilized tillage when compared to the conventional plots that did not utilize tillage. And this is largely in part due to the fact that carbon in no-till systems accumulates at the soil surface where those plant residues are deposited, while in organic tillage systems, the burial of residues results in greater soil carbon at deeper depths. And at those deeper depths, it's not exposed to as much air or sunlight and therefore is more resilient to degradation. So the point of this slide is not to suggest that we shouldn't be promoting no and low-till practices for soil conservation. We should, but it's simply to say that the suite of soil fertility management practices utilized by organic farmers in combination with tillage still leads to greater increases in soil organic carbon than no-till conventional practices. Next slide. So these results are from a new study that analyzed the environmental impact of the complete supply chain for producing a loaf of bread. And what they found was that more than half of the total environmental impact occurred during wheat cultivation. And moreover, the use of ammonium nitrate fertilizer on wheat crops was responsible for the majority of the environmental impact. So it alone accounted for 43% of the total environmental impact of the loaf of bread. So we look at this graph, I want to highlight the second bar, which is the global warming potential. And so the way that you read this essentially is that each of these sort of different colored bars within the greater bar represent a different activity in the process to create that loaf of bread. So we look at everything from, establishing the field all the way up through slicing, packing, and dispatching that loaf of bread. Now, all of the bars, different colors within that bracket, those represent activities that are taking place on the farm level, and that big red bar represents the contribution of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. So the large environmental impact of fertilizer in this study is largely being driven by the carbon dioxide emissions associated with the manufacture of those synthetic fertilizers, which, as I mentioned before, is a very fossil fuel intensive process. And it's also being driven by the release of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide when soil microbes are breaking down excess fertilizer in the soil. Now, of course, nothing about this study focused on organic. However, because organic operations are prohibited from using synthetic fertilizer, this is one huge environmental impact that's automatically eliminated in organic production. Next slide. And then finally, this 2008 study used a life cycle assessment to model the potential reductions in cumulative energy demand and global warming potential if Canada were to transition all of their canola, corn, soy, and wheat crops from conventional to organic production. So the way that you read this graph, on our vertical axis, the y-axis, we have the cumulative energy demand, and then our first bar represents the energy demand for conventional canola, followed by organic canola, conventional corn, followed by organic corn, and so forth. And the results indicate that by completely transitioning to organic, crop production would consume on average 60% less energy than conventional production. Now they also found, next slide. They also found that by transitioning to organic, they generate 25% fewer global warming emissions and 80% fewer ozone-depleting emissions, resulting in a much lower global warming potential for all of these crops under cultivation. And that's the graph that I'm showing you here. So here you can see the total global warming potential, again, for conventional canola, conventional corn, organic corn, and so forth. And again, in this study, the researchers found that these differences were almost exclusively due to differences in soil fertility treatments used in conventional and organic farming. And they were most strongly influenced by the need for fossil fuels to create synthetic fertilizers, as well as the emissions associated with their production. Next slide. So in summary, the literature demonstrates that on average, organic systems have more soil organic carbon, they're more energy efficient, and they emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So now I'm going to take a little bit of time to dive deeper into the new research that was done by soil chemists at Northeastern University's National Soil Project, and this work was done in collaboration with the Organic Center. So this research is a comparison of long-term carbon storage in soils from conventional and organically managed farms. And it was published in the peer-reviewed scientific journal Advances in Agronomy on October 1st. So it just came out a couple months ago. Next slide. So we've talked about the importance of carbon in the soil for climate change mitigation, but carbon is really important for healthy soils in general for a number of other reasons. So it helps reduce erosion, it protects soils against compaction, it improves aeration, water filtration, and water holding capacity of soils, and this is particularly important for times of extended rains or drought. Soil organic carbon is a reserve for essential nutrients that plants need to grow, and it supports soil organisms by providing them with a food source. Next slide. So soil organic carbon is composed of two main pools of carbon molecules. The first pool is called the labile carbon pool. And this pool of molecules is broken down quickly by microorganisms, after which the carbon is returned to the air as carbon dioxide. And because it's being broken down so rapidly, this pool of carbon fluctuates widely from season to season, so it is not stable. The second pool of carbon is long-lived, it's not broken down easily by microbes, and because it's resistant to degradation, it can persist in the soil for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Now, this stable pool of carbon is called humic substances, and it's composed of two primary components, humic acid and fulvic acid. But for right now, I just want you to remember soil organic carbon composed of two pools, that labile pool that's turning over rapidly, and humic substances, which is very stable and represents carbon sequestration over the long term. Next slide. So humic substances are very important because, again, they're the molecules that sequester carbon in the soil, and they're also closely associated with important attributes of soil health, such as increased soil fertility and beneficial soil structure. Next slide. So in this study, we really set out to quantify the amount of humic substances in soils from organic and conventional farms to test the hypothesis that organic soils are better at long-term carbon sequestration. So right now you might be asking yourself, well, hasn't this already been done? And the answer is no, and that's because the methods to do it easily and cheaply just haven't existed until just recently. Next slide. So if you remember the graphs from previous studies that I showed you, where they quantified soil organic carbon in organic and conventional farms, the measure that they and almost every other study that quantifies carbon in the soil uses is called total soil organic carbon. And what that means is that it includes both types of carbon pools, the labile pool, which again is turning over rapidly, as well as humic substances, which again is that stable pool that represents sequestered carbon. However, since that labile pool is fluctuating widely from season to season, you can see how a measure that includes it isn't necessarily going to be the most accurate measure of long-term carbon sequestration. However, as I mentioned until now, there hasn't been an efficient or economical way to separate out these different carbon pools. So total soil organic carbon has been the best measure available to researchers. Next slide. Now, the soil chemists working at the National Soil Project at Northeastern had recently developed a novel method of separating out soil organic matter into these different components. And this new method required a minimal amount of soil and on-farm processing. So previously, in order to conduct this study, soil scientists may have had to visit every location to collect and process samples, whereas now farmers could participate directly by sending us just a small amount of soil. And what this meant is that we were able to collect and analyze more samples from a much broader geographic range than we ever would have been able to do in the past. So the National Soil Project had already collected 728 soil samples from conventional farms across the U.S., and then they partnered with us to collect soil samples from organic farms nationwide. And we managed to bring in 659 soil samples from organic farms to compare to that existing database. Next slide. So the results are pretty clear. Organic farms had higher levels of all sequestered carbon components. If we look at the bottom left graph, we're looking at total soil organic matter. Soils from organic farms had 13% higher levels of soil organic matter. This is what we expected, and it's in line with previous research. But what's really interesting is these two graphs at the top up here, humic acid and fulvic acid. So humic acid and fulvic acid, if you recall, are the two primary components that make up humic substances. So the two parts that make up that stable pool of carbon. And we found that soils from organic farms had 150% more fulvic acid and 44% more humic acid. And then finally, if we look at the graph on the bottom right, this is humification. And basically what humification means is it's the rate in which soil organic matter is converted to humic substances. So sort of the proportion of total soil organic matter that's going to be entering that stable carbon pool. And we found that soils from organic farms had 26% more humification than soils from conventional farms. So these results really highlight the potential of organic agriculture to increase the amount of carbon sequestration in the soil and thus contribute to climate change mitigation. Next slide. So this research is important because, to our knowledge, it's the first large-scale study comparing stable components of organic matter from organic and conventional farms. Next slide. It takes a broad view and incorporates variation across management styles. So in the past, for every study that's compared organic farming to conventional farming and find favorable results, people will say, yeah, but that's just 2+, or that's only 10 farms, or maybe that's only farms in one state. And those results can't really be extrapolated to compare, organic generally to conventional generally, because there's just too much variation in farming methods, commodity types, geography, soil type, climate, et cetera, within those two categories. But in this study, we had the opportunity to compare carbon sequestration in organic and conventional farms using a really robust sample size across a wide geographic range. And we found that in spite of all of that variation, in farming methods, commodity, geography, we were still able to detect a strong and significant difference, which shows that the similarities among organic farms are important enough that we can discern a significant pattern across production systems when it comes to long-term carbon storage. Next slide. And then finally, this study shows that organic farming can build soil health and contribute to climate change mitigation. And if you're a consumer or, you're messaging consumers, I always like this, it's great if you know your farmer and you know the practices that they're implementing. But for me personally, what this shows me is that even if I don't have time to know all the farmers at my farmer's market or investigate all the ingredient suppliers for the food that I purchase, I can still choose organic and know that I'm going to make a difference. Next slide. So the take-home points that I want to leave you with are that organic agriculture as a whole can positively impact climate change mitigation through carbon sequestration. On average, organic agriculture is more energy efficient than conventional agriculture, largely through the omission of fossil fuel-based fertilizers. And then finally, there's still room for improvement within organic to contribute even more to climate change mitigation. So there's lots of good work that's being done on this front by farmers, researchers, and industry, and that work is even more critical than ever now.